You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 30th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Mainstream German party cooperates with the far right, which hardly ever goes badly. Spain and Portugal grudgingly rummage in the sofa cushions for contributions to Europe's defence. And a venerable London drinking club is importuned to admit women as members. Where will it end? They'll be wanting the vote next. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Marta Lorimer and Robin Lustig will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from is a letter from the Greek islands, specifically Sifnos. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I'm joined today by Marta Lorimer, lecturer in politics at Cardiff University, and Robin Lustig, journalist and broadcaster, former presenter of The World Tonight on Radio 4. Hello to you both.
Hi.
Hello.
You have either both been or are going to points, well, not quite polar opposites, but actually not all that far off, if you think about it. Robin, first of all, because you have been to Cape Town.
I have been to Cape Town, which is a long way south and therefore a long way warmer. And it was glorious. It was actually quite annoying because everybody's told me for years how glorious and beautiful Cape Town is. I'd been to South Africa several times, but I'd never actually been to Cape Town. And damn it, it is absolutely as beautiful and as glorious as everybody said.
Did you keep missing out on Cape Town because you were doing reporting stuff that did not involve just going somewhere nice?
Yes, unfortunately so. As you know, Andrew, when one travels as a journalist, one doesn't go to nice places, one goes to nasty places. And I never seemed to have the downtime that was available to go to Cape Town. So I'm really, really pleased that I got there because it was wonderful.
So you would recommend?
I would recommend Cape Town, which was recently named the best city in the world.
Really? By whom?
By Time Out magazine.
See, the thing is, I have to go at that because Monocle, of course, does a yearly assessment of the cities with the greatest quality of life, and I'm pretty sure Cape Town didn't make our list.
What can I say?
Anyway, on that note of controversy, we will move on to your imminent trip, Marta, to Oslo, and it does seem like, given my own recollections of Oslo broadly this time of year, I'd have given it another few months if I were you.
Yes, I didn't really have a choice in terms of the date. It was said to me that there was availability to present my research on the 4th of February, and I said yes, even though I knew it was going to be probably in the minus degrees and also very dark.
To be clear, the 4th of February is the date on which you are presenting your research. It is not the subject of your research. It could be both.
It could be both. I'm not aware of anything interesting happening the 4th of February off the top of my head, but yes, I am presenting my work in Oslo that day.
What is it actually about, if not the 4th of February?
It's a very, very sexy paper on political ideologies in the European Union.
Well, actually, you say that in a sort of slightly dismissive and deadpan tone of voice, but it does actually kind of tee up our first item. Because in Germany...
See?
Seamless.
Magic.
In Germany, it does seem that lofty pledges previously issued by likely next Chancellor Friedrich Merz of the Christian Democratic Union to the effect that he would never collaborate with the feral xenophobes of Alternative for Germany may not have been as ironclad as Merz insisted. Yesterday, the CDU got a non-binding resolution on tougher immigration through the Bundestag with the help of the AfD's votes. Predictably, this incited the condemnation of current Chancellor Olaf Scholz of the Social Democrats. Less predictably, it incited ditto from previous Chancellor Angela Merkel of the CDU. Robin, Friedrich Merz is claiming he can't help it if the AfD support him. Is that really a get-out card here?
Not really. He knew what was going to happen. He knew that it would cause a fuss, and I suspect he's not too bothered about it. There's an election on, which he wants to win, and he wants to minimise as far as possible the number of voters who are tempted to desert his party and switch to the AfD. So if he can persuade them that on some issues at least he and the AfD are not that far apart, then maybe that's to his party's good. You know, because my memory goes back such a long way, Margaret Thatcher, back in the 1970s in this country, used a phrase about immigration. She said something like, people are worried about being swamped by people from other cultures. And that word swamped was absolutely toxic at the time because it was used by a far-right party, the National Front. What happened? The Tory vote went up very considerably, and it worked to her advantage. So I think Herr Merz knows what he's doing.
But does that work in the current era, though, Marta? Because it strikes me that what we often see is that you get the centrist party, the respectable centrist party, like the CDU, trying to park its tanks on the far right's lawn and trying to win over a few of the far right's voters. But don't they run the risk of actually just alienating the voters they already have and then not getting any of the far right voters because they're not far right enough?
Yes, since we're in the business of citing dubious right-wing figures, in the 1980s, Jean-Marie Le Pen put it rather nicely when he said, between the original and the copy, the voters will always choose the original. And what we actually know from recent research on the radical right, and particularly on mainstream parties co-opting their policies, that does absolutely nothing for their success. They don't really get their votes back because once a voter has started voting for the far right, they very rarely go back to the mainstream parties. But also, the only thing this does, it legitimizes the policy points that the far right is making. So you are basically emboldening your adversaries, who also then have to double down on their measures and get even more extreme, but you're not really getting any of the voters back. So I think Merz might be thinking that this is a genius idea. He's not the first one to think that. But maybe he should read out on research on this topic.
Can you recommend any?
There's been a recent book that came out, not by me. My book is also
I was
great.
trying to help you there.
Thank you very much. But yes, my book deals in ideas. But there's some really interesting research that came out by a scholar in Spain called Vicente Valentin, and he has written about how the sort of the progressive change in social norms around the acceptability of voting for the far right. So this is, and there's really a wealth of research on this. So we know what we know.
There is a real dilemma, though, isn't there? Which is that the issue of immigration, and particularly of illegal immigration, is a perfectly legitimate subject for political debate. The fact that in many, many different countries, both in Europe and elsewhere, it is the parties of the far right that have been beating that drum and going with that issue makes it very difficult for other parties to engage credibly on the same issue and to say things which will both be sensible, pragmatic, humane, but also attractive to voters. And so I think Friedrich Merz actually illustrates that dilemma quite clearly by doing what he thinks is likely to win him votes, but in the knowledge that he is moving perilously close to AfD territory.
Marta, on a separate question of political science, separate but related, there is this idea at large, not just in Germany, but in a few other similarly afflicted European polities called the cordon sanitaire, which just holds that you just don't deal with these people. They are beyond the pale, and I don't care how many people vote for them, I am just not going to deal with them. We've seen it historically against the AfD in Germany, certainly against the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, although to sort of bolster my point, they won the last election. We've seen it 2 elections on the bounce, really, in the Republic of Ireland, where Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have got together to keep out a party who are not far right, this being Sinn Féin, but are, of course, held to have unacceptable associations with the very, very recent past. The trouble is, though, does it work forever? Because it plays into the far right's narrative, doesn't it? That, we are being suppressed, the desires of the common folk are being overlooked by these fancy centrist liberals in their ivory towers. And as we saw with the Freedom Party, they didn't get Geert Wilders into the prime ministership, but they won that election.
Yes, exactly. There's another wonderful researcher that I want to cite. She's called Leonie de Jonge, and she has also worked precisely on this idea of a cordon sanitaire and specifically how the media deal with the far right. And I think that this is kind of the problem, right? That you can keep up that cordon sanitaire for a while, But it is probably not really going to last forever. And at some point, you have to find different ways of actually dealing with the radical right. And what we've seen in Europe is that this cordon sanitaire is, I think, pretty much dead and buried. Probably Germany was the last place where you could say, well, that's fine. It's still up. They're still saying they're not going to work for the AfD. But I think that this vote has really changed the game here, because you have someone who went in there knowing that their measures were going to pass only with the support of the far right, and did it nonetheless.
Just a final quick thought on this, Robin, prompted by Marta mentioning media coverage. Is that a problem? Because if we think of that in the UK context, there is a thing where the far right, like all extremes, that it's exciting, it's attractive, it's fun to report on. And here in this country, and this is not an original observation, we have the case where I think we can call them far right party Reform, which won a bare handful of seats at the last general election. This is Reform led by Nigel Farage, versus the Liberal Democrats, who are about the softest, mushiest, centrist political party you could possibly imagine, won a fairly thumping 72 seats at the most recent general election, which gets most of the coverage.
Yeah, well, that's partly a function, of course, of Britain's crazy electoral system and
True.
the way in which the House of Commons does not represent the number of votes cast. But I think there is a problem for the media. For many years in the past, there was a general media consensus that, for example, leaving the European Union was not really up for debate. Britain had joined the EU and there it would be. And despite a number of politicians, including Nigel Farage, banging away and saying that we need to discuss this, the media didn't really give it a lot of coverage. Similarly, the issue of immigration, because most British journalists are based in London and because London is a hugely multi-ethnic and multicultural city, it was taken for granted that that was the way things were, and it worked pretty well. That was not the feeling elsewhere in the country. After the Brexit vote in 2016, the media went, oh my God, we missed out on something here. And I think, at least in my view, they have now overcompensated by giving huge amounts of coverage, perhaps more than is warranted, to that strand of political thought.
Well, let's look now at Europe with specific reference to the hitherto somewhat laggardly spending on defence of one or two NATO members who seem to have been drifting along on the assumption that Russia is all the way over there. What does it have to do with us, etc.? Following an apparent revving up from newish NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, on whose long watch as Prime Minister of the Netherlands, incidentally, Dutch defence spending never got anywhere near NATO's nominal 2% of GDP threshold, Spain's Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares and Portugal's Prime Minister Luis Montenegro have both averred that their countries will get to 2% by 2029. No rush whenever you're ready. Marta, first of all, there is, we see here, I think, the sort of sliding scale of unconcern as one tracks further west across Europe. I mean, Spain, Portugal have been trailing behind 2%, whereas Poland is going to nudge 5% of its GDP this year. Estonia, Latvia and Greece all over 3%.
Yes, those are countries, particularly in the Baltics, there has been a real concern with Russia for much longer than in the rest of Europe. So already back in 2014, they were saying, look, be very, very careful. We have to be mindful of whatever it is that Russia is doing. And, most of the west of Europe was like, yeah, no, you're just being a little bit paranoid because of your historical experiences with Russia. They have changed, really reassure you. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think, changed minds about Russia having changed its methods, but I don't think it has necessarily changed where people spend their money in most of Europe. So yes, we're seeing countries that are on the border that are very close to Russia, for whom it is not a hard sell to say we are going to spend more on defense, actually spending more on defense. Everyone else is saying, yeah, we realize we have to do something. However, money is tight these days. We're going to have to take some time to get there.
Nevertheless, Robin, Europe has had 3 years now, some would argue 10, depending on where you measure this from, to get used to the idea that Russia is once again an active menace. Europe has had, what are we up to now, 9 years to get used to the idea that the United States is perfectly capable of electing somebody like Donald Trump, who may not regard Europe's defence as a particular American priority. Why have so few European countries got with the programme?
Because they hoped desperately that somehow these problems would go away again.
Hope is not a strategy, as
Hope is
somebody
not a
once
strategy, indeed not. The first Trump administration was regarded by most people in Europe as an aberration. It would be corrected 4 years later and all would be well again. Well, for 4 years maybe it was, but then along comes the 2024 election, and guess what? President Trump is back in the White House. So put together Putin's invasion of Ukraine and Trump's re-election as president, even more energized than he was first time round, and European nations are terrified because the basic assumption of European defence strategy since the end of the Second World War was that if things get really bad, the US will come and help us out, and they can no longer be sure of that.
Well, indeed not. I mean, depending on how things pan out in Greenland, we might actually end up fighting in the other direction. But is it as simple, Marta, as that any elected government in Europe, and at this point I think we can be a little bit sympathetic to them, finds itself in a trap in that if it goes out to its people and says, look, here is the thing, we are going to have to spend huge on defence. This is going to cost a lot of money, by which we mean a lot of your money. It's not inconceivable that your children might end up in uniform, whether they like it or not. Nobody's going to win another election on that pitch, are they?
No, they're not, and especially not now. I think if they had tried this out when Russia had just invaded Ukraine, and there was a lot of sympathy towards Ukraine
There was.
in that moment, then maybe it could have been a cell. It could have been a cell of sorts. I think the further we get from the beginning of the conflict, the more this becomes. It's not a frozen conflict; it's still a very alive conflict. But I think in the mind of a lot of Europeans, it's not really going anywhere. So they're just asking themselves, why is it that we should spend money on a country that is far from us when we don't have, we're not doing that great back at home. So I think that it is very difficult for any government to actually go in there and say, no, we actually want to keep spending to support Ukraine because it is the right thing to do, when people might feel that that's not where their own country's priority.
Just a final quick thought on this one, Robin. It's never been clear to me that President Trump actually understands what the 2% of GDP threshold means or how this works. He seems to think it's a bit like, I don't know, fees you pay the freeholder, etc. This is some sort of membership fee that everybody has to cough up, and he probably thinks it's paid to the United States. Nevertheless, and I'm not clear on the legalities of it, should the treaty be redrafted to say this is no longer an aspiration, this is compulsory, you either stump up or you're out?
Try getting agreement on that from all NATO members.
I'm not saying... I'm just having ideas over here, Robin.
You won't often hear me. In fact, I don't think I've ever said these words before. But on this, Trump is right. Europe has underpaid its contributions to NATO for many, many years, and the US has been relied upon. Now, that's a decision for the US administration to make and US voters to make, whether that's a burden of responsibility that they're prepared to shoulder in the future. As we know, in the past, in the 20th century, the US took the view that it was in US interests for Europe to be at peace. It may be that Mr. Trump takes the view that it doesn't really matter to the US whether Europe is at peace or not. It doesn't really matter to the US whether Mr. Putin invades the Baltic states or Ukraine. Doesn't really matter to the US whether China takes Taiwan by force. All of these things, he might argue, are nothing to do with the US. In the past, that was not the view. Now, perhaps it is increasingly the view, particularly while he's in the White House. So there are some very, very difficult calculations to be made.
Well, let us now consider an aspect of journalism, despite the famous reluctance of practitioners of the trade to talk about the media or themselves. It is a common and reasonable complaint that our politics and social media are increasingly suborned by people and entities who just plain make things up. Earlier this week, for example, US President Donald Trump claimed that he had shut down a taxpayer-funded program which was poised to, quote, send $50 million to Gaza to buy condoms for Hamas, which, can I shock you, isn't true. But are dedicated fact-checkers any use at such a moment, and are they as beholden to biases as anyone else? Marta, we are discussing this off the back of a very interesting piece in the Swiss newspaper NZZ, which I do commend to our listeners, which suggests that bias is just as much a problem with the fact-checkers as the people whose facts they are checking.
I have so many conflicting feelings about the article because on one hand, I completely agree that if you're a fact checker, you probably should be trying to check facts and give actual real facts about things that really happened in return. And I kind of agree that sometimes it is truth that the reality is murky. But I think one of the critiques that this article levels is that, a lot of fact checkers are simply pushing a left-wing agenda. And I also want to say, maybe it's just because, at least for now, the left has a little bit less of a tendency to lie wildly about things. I think in the last few years, the movements that I've seen that are a lot more reluctant to actually care about facts are movements on the right. So I kind of understand why there might be a left-wing bias here. So I think, as a general predicament, yes, if you're a fact checker, you should probably be dealing with facts and not spreading lies yourself. But from here to saying, it's clear that all fact checkers are wild left-wingers, I'm like, well, the problem is that maybe there's just a little bit less to check on the left.
At the moment, that's probably true. But it is the case, is it not, Robin, that all media entities, like all entities, do have institutional leanings, institutional biases. I, for example, could have demonstrated my point just now not by citing Donald Trump spouting mad nonsense about buying condoms for Hamas, but instead I could have hunted around and found a left-wing politician spouting mad nonsense about something or other, which is, to be clear, very far from unheard of.
I think this is a very dangerous argument. That's an opinion, not a fact. I can't prove it. The idea that facts are themselves evidence of political bias, I think, is really, really dangerous. I mean, I've spent my entire career devoted to trying to establish what is true and what isn't true. And I am absolutely convinced in my own mind that there are some things which are provably true and some things which are provably not. There are also many other things which fall into a very grey area in between. I can say, for example, Andrew Muller is the best broadcaster ever to come out of Australia. I can't prove...
Sorry, Steph, I'm just speaking to the producer. Steph, can we clip that? No, we can't.
I can't prove that that's a fact, but it is my opinion, because best is not provable. If I say 2 + 2 = 4, that is a fact. It is a provable fact. And I think there is a clear difference, and I think all journalists and media practitioners need to be clear. There is a clear difference between things that are provably true and things that are not provably true. What Donald Trump said about the condoms to Gaza was provably untrue. What he said the other day about the majority of people in Greenland wanting to be Americans, well, not provably untrue, but there was an opinion poll in Greenland the other day which suggested that 85% of people in Greenland did not want to be part of the United States. I said suggested because we know that opinion polls don't prove anything. So I will never say that an opinion poll proves something, but I will say, and I believe that I am justified in saying that, an opinion poll can suggest certain things. And what it suggests is that Donald Trump was telling a porky.
But just to follow that up quickly, Robin, the thing is about facts being, inviolable and having their own unarguable integrity is true enough. But is it not more often the case that media or a media institution reveals its biases, not in terms of just making things up, but whenever you report on anything, you can't tell the entire story. So biases get manifested in what facts you decide to include and what facts you decide not to.
Absolutely right. Context is all. I can choose which facts to emphasise and which facts to leave out. That demonstrates bias, whether conscious or unconscious. Every story decision that a journalist makes, I will cover this, I won't cover that. Your example of Donald Trump was an example of you making a choice which illustrates something. It doesn't illustrate that what you said was untrue, and readers and listeners and viewers need to be aware that all journalism, all media involves choices, but there is still a difference between what is true and what isn't true.
Marta, just finally on this is especially obviously a problem on social media, from where depressing numbers of people do now get their news, despite the fact that a lot of it, to borrow Robin's phrase, is demonstrably untrue, demonstrable nonsense. We did hear recently from Facebook that they were going to dispense with fact checkers, which shocked me in that I didn't realise Facebook had any fact checkers. But they are going to go instead with the approach that former Twitter, now X, takes, which is the so-called community note, in which you can... And it does Well, what I'm going to pitch here, just as Robin reluctantly agrees with Donald Trump, I might reluctantly semi-agree with Elon Musk. Does that kind of work? If something that somebody posts on social media, ideally reasonably rapidly, gets a little thing under it saying, this is just absolute garbage, here is what actually is the case.
It can work if you have the kind of knowledge to actually respond to that. And I think that's the...
Wikipedia is an example of that.
Wikipedia is an example.
Roughly happening.
The wisdom of crowds.
Exactly. There's sort of this
here.
wisdom of crowds. There's some kind of conversation going on because there's a lot of people who are talking about these things at the same time. I think that the problem happens when you have something that is non-demonstrably untrue. And I think that is probably where also the limits of community fact-checking might fall.
Just one very quick other example, Andrew, if I may. The awful murders of 3 young girls in the northern English city of Southport last summer resulted in a slew of reports on social media that the assailant was an illegal Muslim immigrant, which resulted in riots on the streets of the city and attacks on Muslim targets. He was not an illegal immigrant. He was not a Muslim. At the time, people either didn't know that or didn't care whether or not it was true, but they wanted it to be true. That's really dangerous, and it is a case, I would argue, where social media owners have a responsibility to fact-check, because it can result in very serious social issues if it's not checked.
Yeah, if I can just add a very quick... I think a lot of the problem here is that we're always doing post-mortems on these fact checks, right? The fact is already out there by the time you've been able to fact check it. And that's really where the challenge with social media is.
That is halfway around the world before the truth has got its roots on.
The classic quote. And we don't really know. We have to find a much better way to sort of deal with these before they're even out there.
Well, to woeful tidings now for one member of tonight's panel who will never know what it is to slump into one of the leather armchairs of the Savile Club in Mayfair, slurp down a gallon of port, wince at their accelerating gout, and grumble about the merits of a return to the gold standard. The venerable institution, founded 1868, has rejected a motion which would have admitted women, except presumably to sweep up the biscuit crumbs. Members of the Savile against the motion grimly portended that women would undermine the camaraderie and fretted that they were under assault by, quote, the woke mind virus. Robin, how did you vote?
As if. I am not a member of the Savile Club. I have not been, nor will I ever be a member of the Savile Club, or indeed any other of these ghastly so-called gentlemen's clubs in London. I have been to the Savile Club a couple of times because at one time I had a friend who was a member and he used to invite me for lunch. I don't want to land you with a libel writ, but let's just say it wasn't my cup of tea or even my glass of port. Why anybody in this day and age would want to belong to a club of that kind is utterly beyond me. Do you know what the most depressing thing about this is, according to the report I read?
Is it that they're not more worried about the name?
Well, there's that too. The majority of the members, apparently, who voted against allowing women to be members were the younger members. And that, I find, deeply depressing.
To be clear, Robin, I am with you on this one. I don't think there are enough wild horses left in Europe that would get me up the front steps of such an establishment. But Marjorie, are you tremendously affronted by this?
Deeply affronted by the fact that I will not be able to be a member. This was so important to me. This is the reason I moved to Britain, because I wanted to be a member of a gentleman's and gentle ladies club. No, I have once been in one of these establishments.
How? Were you disguised?
I was a guest.
Oh, okay.
I was the guest of one of the members. And it was a lovely place, but I don't think it would have been in any way diminished by the presence of women. There was plenty of space where if you want to be a man and not see a woman, you can find a corner where you will not be confronted.
The garden shed is the obvious place.
Of course. That's where men belong, as far as I'm concerned. Do I have to say that I'm joking before I get fired? Anyway, so yeah, I'm just... I find this. I still find the establishment, the idea that gentlemen's clubs exist, slightly puzzling, and the fact that we are now in the 21st century and it's still okay to have something that is for men only. And what I would like to do is speak to the people who voted against these and ask them, are you also against DEI initiatives that are aimed at women only. Because I can tell you, these are exactly the kind of people who would get extremely angry if at work there was an organization that was for women only.
Well, yeah, I mean, I, by way of contrast, Marta, would not like to speak to any of these people because I really struggle with the company of boring nutters. But if we leave aside the prospect, Robin, of wanting to associate with this particular group of men, is there necessarily anything wrong with the idea of a men-only establishment?
There is something intrinsically wrong with any kind of social organisation which bans people solely on grounds of their gender. I don't think it is acceptable to say that the armed forces or the priesthood or the Savile Club or whatever institution you like is simply not open to 50% of the population. It makes no sense and it's not right.
Does it surprise you, though, just finally on this, Marta, to pick up Robin's earlier point, that it is actually the younger chaps who are apparently most militantly opposed to the idea of women joining?
It does surprise me a little bit, but there's also a way in which I think that some of the men in sort of roughly my age cohort or sort of the younger generations feel that the arrival of women on the work scene and sort of inclusive initiatives and all these things have basically stolen their rightfully earned jobs from them. And that is something that I think is worrying, because there's this tendency to see equality as something that is a zero-sum game where we know that is not actually the case. So it's depressing. It's not necessarily surprising, because I have heard some men around me say that, the reason I don't have a job yet is because I am a white man.
Oh, I'm pretty sure that's not the case.
I'm also quite sure it's not the case, but...
Marta Lorimer and Robin Lustig, thank you both very much for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our weekly letter from takes us to Greece, where the Monocle Books team has spent months vagabonding for our latest Monocle handbook, which is available now. And obviously, you can't make a book about Greece without exploring its plethora of islands. And our very own Chiara Ramella is here to tell you that Sifnos may be the very best among them.
What makes the perfect Greek island, or island in general for that matter? The answer may differ from person to person, but for me, the criteria are pretty clear and well defined. First, size. The perfect island must be small enough to be traversable comfortably on a 50cc scooter, partly because of my ineptitude at driving an actual car, partly because few things are as satisfying as whizzing down to the beach in shorts, bikini top, sandals and helmet, with only some large sunglasses to protect you from the wind. Then, beach access. Sure, there's a romanticism to an island whose coves can exclusively be explored by boat, but let's face it, the quick jaunt to the shop for a can of something frosty, or the languid lunch at the taverna without even putting your shoes back on, beats any more logistically challenging option. Speaking of tavernas, food is a big component. You want an island that's seen enough cosmopolitan influx to surprise you with a few fancy spots should the occasion arise, but a large number of down-to-earth establishments that are still true to their roots. Bearing all of this in mind, when it came to choosing which island I should visit on my July trip to Greece, I felt like I was trying to find the impossible meeting point in a complex Venn diagram. Close enough to Athens, but not so close that it's full of tourists. Rugged, yes, but not too rugged. Quiet, yes, but not too quiet. The answer, after much reading, questioning and investigating, turned out to be Sifnos. Every Greek person will tell you that they have one favorite island that they swear by, and almost everyone's is different. That might be partly because there are around 6,000 islands in Greece's waters, 227 of which are actually inhabited. But it's also because people choose the place that feels most akin to their personality and taste, and each island has a distinct identity and feel which would be impossible to guess by just looking at the map alone. Something happened when the door of the ferry creaked open to unload us in the astonishingly crystalline bay of Kamaris. I just knew I'd met the one. Sifnos is breezy, light-hearted, classy. In amongst its neighbours in the Cyclades, it remains relatively unexplored compared to big-box counterparts like Mykonos and Santorini, but it's had some of the best version of their cool rub off a bit too. Most people will refer to Sifnos as the island that's famous for its gastronomic credentials. Salamentes, the Greek chef who, at the turn of the 20th century, went on to write one of the nation's most influential and defining cookbooks, was born here. It makes sense then that as the host of Monocle's food podcast, The Menu, I was drawn to these shores. Perhaps most notably for those who want to visit, though, Sifnos is now home to some restaurants that are objectively worthy of countrywide acclaim, starting from Cantina, a tiny terrace jutting out from a whitewashed hut, steps away from the crashing waves at the foothill of the citadel of Castro. Lunch under the sun-dappled pergola of Pelicanos, its sister restaurant, is also a thing of surreal beauty. You can try to find a better tara masalata than this, but you'll struggle. Then there were the grilled sardines in the fisherman's harbour at Keronisso Fish Tavern, the cataifi dessert at Bostani, the chickpea stew at Celementes, and the endless glasses of Assyrtiko on the wide steps of Loggia Wine Bar, cascading down the flank of the walls of Castro. Sifnos's culinary reputation isn't just historical, but well earned in the present, and there's no doubt that it will spawn more enticing spots soon. On my reporting trip as the editor of the Monocle Book of Greece, I also visited other islands. They were brilliant, beautiful, unexpected. I loved them all and endeavoured to transmit their inherent differences in the stories that we published in the volume. And yet, none of them got under my skin quite as much as Sifnos. In the book, you'll find pieces written by journalists whose heart beats for Samos, Lipsi, Andros, Corfu. Some of them can't quite explain why they came to be so attached to the places they picked. But then again, sometimes falling in love with a spot is about finding the answer to the recipe for the perfect island. Some other times, it's just a matter of following your instinct.
Thank you, Chiara. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Marta Lorimer and Robin Lustig. Today's show was produced by Carlotta Rebello and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.